Okay, well, we'll make a start. Thanks for all those who have attended online. And for those who are watching this after the fact through the recording, we welcome you as well. Um, just before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we are today. For me, I'm on Boonwurrung land. For others, you may be, I'm not sure where you are around the country, but we respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. And remember that these have been lands where learning has always taken place through storytelling and the sharing of experiences. And that's why we're running this webinar today, is to share some of our experiences, to talk a little bit about what we know and how we go about comms in a cybersecurity incident, and also perhaps to hear some of your questions so that we can learn from each other. So I hope we all approach the webinar today in that spirit. You can see we're going to talk about red teaming your comms during a cybersecurity incident. One thing I'm going to kick off with, which is kind of half funny and half serious, but don't rely on AI to do the work for you and write your comms and do things for you. If you look at the image closely that's on the screen now, you'll see this isn't a very, very good soccer team because there were two 13s and two 15s on the thing. So don't rely on AI to do all the heavy lifting for you, because it is prone to making silly mistakes as you go along. So, this is really a focus on using your skills as a professional to support your businesses and your clients, if you hear from the PR side of things, through cybersecurity incidents. Just a little bit about us. So Kathryn and I, we run Media-Wize. We founded Media-Wize, I think, just over 6 years ago. As you can see from here, look, we've got plenty of experience working in across PR, particularly around the B2B space. I've worked as a journalist for a very long time before moving across the fence into the PR world. But Kathryn and I bring quite diverse experience to this. Kathryn from the PR side, and I've been on the inside of a whole bunch of different sorts of security and cybersecurity and tech incidents. Worked on BCP, business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning. Kathryn's worked across with numerous companies and government sectors as well, handling crisis media comms. We've worked in this space for a very long time, and we've been really thinking hard about this particular topic and about red teaming your comms during cybersecurity incidents. Just as a very quick explanation, for those of you who come from a non-technical side of the world, perhaps, just a very quick thing about what red teaming is. So if you kind of think about the world as having good guys and bad guys, a red team is a team of ethical hackers that are hired to penetrate your defenses so that you can learn where your weak spots are. So when we talk about red teaming your comms, what we're really talking about is thinking about it from the outsider's point of view and asking the questions that they're going to ask. What's the media going to look for in this? What are your customers going to look for during an incident? What are your suppliers going to look for in an incident? Maybe even what regulators are going to look for. So it's about really not thinking specifically about the technical response about what you're doing during an incident, but thinking about how you're going to communicate with the outside world about that incident. So that's why we've talked about this being about red teaming your comms during a crisis. Why is this important? What we see from a number of incidents is how you handle your incident publicly is at least as important as how you do it technically. In fact, there are times when I would argue that how you communicate about an incident is probably more important than what you do technically. I think the world is reasonably mature in understanding that cybersecurity incidents are a thing that are going to happen. Companies are, they see the reports where companies are under constant attack. So how you respond to an attack outwardly is super important. Many of the organisations that are on this webinar today have probably got really great really great recovery plans, really great crisis plans for a cybersecurity incident that cover all the technical aspects of getting systems online, protecting users, and all that sort of stuff. But we're really talking about what you've got to do during a crisis so that you can, protect your organization's operations, protect your finances, your reputation, and also not just of the organization as a broader group, but also the individuals inside it. There are board members. Boards are really keen on this at the moment because obviously how an incident unfolds impacts them directly. It impacts your staff, the owners of businesses, partners, suppliers. The impact can be really, really broad. So we really want people to think about how is it that you're going to be dealing with the outside world during a crisis. When we start this, we need to actually think about what your triggers are. What sorts of crises are we talking about? I like this example with the smoke alarm, the fire extinguisher, and the fireman. Not every incident that happens is going to require a major response from a major comms response. I think of it being like a smoke alarm, might be one computer or one user is impacted by ransomware, or it's a relatively minor incident where maybe one customer record is exposed accidentally. And this can happen just through an inadvertently sent email is one way that can happen. You might have something a bit larger where it's a small department or a small group of people. That's where you need the fire extinguisher, where you've got to actually do something active and be prepared to do something active. And then there's the fireman when you have a really big issue where you've got to call someone in to come and help manage your issue, manage the comms for you. Of course, where you don't want to be is major disaster land, because obviously that's where all sorts of things roll in. That's where regulators get interested, insurers get interested, your suppliers, your entire partner ecosystem can be impacted. So I really want to think about what are the triggers where you're going to let things happen as well. So from a comms point of view, you may not want to talk to, it talks about anyone go out broadly for an incident that impacts a single person, but for something that impacts the whole business or a big group of customers, that's when you've got to think about what your threshold is for moving along and broadening your comms response. So let's talk a little bit about what sorts of incidents we might be talking about. Look, there are 9 here, but there are probably a whole bunch of others that you can think of. The leak of customer data through an unauthorized party. That's when a bad person gets into your systems and starts stealing data. You might be talking about authorized access to data. This one's a really interesting one. We often see this with, there's been a number of examples of this where people who have permission to look at data but shouldn't go ahead and do it. And we see this often in health. We've seen it in policing, for example, where someone goes into a system and looks up records that they ought not have been looking at. Loss of access to data or systems can happen in all sorts of different ways. It could be anything from workers outside your building putting the front end loader through a cable, through to a particular service provider breaking their access. Supply chain compromise is a big deal where you're not impacted directly, but someone you deal with is, and through that other party, access to your systems is gained. Collateral damage, where it wasn't you that was attacked, but you've been impacted by an attack on someone else. Unauthorized access to systems is the hacker. Public interface compromise. This can be a really nasty one. We used to think about this just in terms of website defacements and things like that, but it extends to your social media being impacted or hacked. So if someone gets access to your Instagram account or your Facebook account or some other social media, and then start putting messages up there, it can impact businesses pretty heavily. And we've seen that particularly in the US with public companies where their Twitter accounts have been attacked. Bad guys have gone in, put a few messages in, and all of a sudden share prices go, tank really quickly. Nation state attacks will impact some people on this call. That's when, hostile governments or parties that are sponsored by hostile governments decide to attack you. These are really hard to deal with because you're dealing with, highly motivated, highly resourced attackers. And then the interruption of, of critical service, which can have flow-on impacts. The pandemic is a great example of that, where different providers lost access to things and the impacts were pretty broad. So there's a whole bunch of different things that can happen. And one of the challenges is that you want to control the message. It's almost impossible today to keep secrets. This example is one that goes back, 4 years or so with Cleanaway. But when an executive came out and spoke at a company town hall meeting and talked about an incident and said, please don't leak this, the first thing that happened was it leaked. So you need to we're really thinking here about how the information is managed and flows during an incident, because it is really important to do. So With that, if any of you do have questions as we go along, please pop them into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to them once I've sort of finished the presentation part. But I'm hoping we'll have plenty of time for questions when we get to the end. So let's talk a little bit about some specific examples. I'm an old Western fan, which is why you get a bit of Clint Eastwood here with the good, the bad, and the ugly. I want to start with a good example of an incident that occurred a few years ago, but it was handled really, really well. And I do this because I don't want us to think that we're always going to be super defensive here. While crisis comms can be very challenging, you can do it in a way that actually ultimately enhances the reputation of the organization and shows that you're really good, you really do care about what's going on. So I want to talk a little bit about the Red Cross Blood Service. This is a really well-known attack. Well, it wasn't actually an attack, it was an accidental breach. An IT contractor copied a whole bunch of data to a cloud storage service. Security wasn't set up correctly, and the data was exposed. And it was actually data relating to about over 500,000 blood donors. So that included all sorts of really, really personal, sensitive information. The good news is that when it was discovered and ethically reported. So a good guy found it just on some random scanning when they were looking around. They found it and reported it rather than using the data for nefarious purposes. The risk of misuse was assessed as low because it was detected within 24 hours of it actually happening. So the data was only exposed for a relatively short time. The risk to individuals whose data was leaked was very, very low, or assessed as low. The response from the Red Cross Blood Service was probably, I'd still say even today, is close to the gold standard of how we should respond to incidents. Every impacted person was directly notified. And while that might sound like a really easy thing to do, or easy thing to say to do at least, it's really, really interesting when you say to people, how would you go and contact everyone? Does your organization have the means to go and contact every person that you deal with should something happen? And then do you have the means to contact them if you don't have access to your own systems? It's a really tricky question to ask. If you lost access to your own email system because of an attack, could you still contact all your customers and let them know what was going on if you had to? So you need to think about how you're going to communicate should you lose your own access. Part of this response was that the CEO actually took direct responsibility, even though they didn't do the mistake themselves. There was a third-party contractor that accidentally exposed this data. The CEO at the time of the Red Cross Blood Services made this statement. Now, if you read this statement and look at the words in it, the words sorry, taking responsibility, apologising, acknowledging, apologising again, they owned the problem, even though they didn't do it directly themselves. They talked about their responsibility to their customers, or to blood donors in this instance, and why they take that super seriously. And they talk about accountability and being accountable themselves. Now, they notified all 550,000 people. They told them what happened and they owned it. They took responsibility for it. A lot of the time when I look at some of the responses to incidents that happen, there's a lot of blame shifting and finger pointing that goes on. Now, ultimately, if I deal with an organization and they're breached, as a customer, I don't care what the source was. I want it fixed, and I want to know that the people who own my data or being part of that process, I want to know as a customer that they have done their utmost to protect me and help me through this situation. So I always think there's some lessons to learn from these. And with the Red Cross Blood Service incident, the lessons were that they spoke about facts. They didn't point the finger specifically at the contractor that was involved, but they said, we work with an external contractor who exposed the data. It was only exposed for 24 hours. The risk was relatively low. They gave them facts. They took responsibility and said, even though it was a third-party contractor, it's our problem. We own the problem and we're going to own the solution. And they had really great notification processes. They were able to email, text, and also work through public channels to make sure that every potentially impacted person was notified about what was going on. let's talk a bit about the bad. I'm going to point to a couple of really, really well-known incidents that have happened over the last couple of years or so. Let's talk about Optus. Um, Somewhere between 2.5 and almost 10 million former and current customer records were exfiltrated through a poorly secured API. So if you don't know what an API is, it's basically a bit of software that connects different bits of software together. So it's the kind of thing where it's kind of like a little pipe between two different software systems. So there was one that was poorly secured, and someone was able to exfiltrate a whole bunch of data by effectively breaking into that API. About 10,000 customer records were leaked before the attacker broke off demands for a ransom. So out of that, almost we're between 2.5 and almost 10 million records only, and I say only because it's a relatively small portion, not because those people weren't impacted, but only 10,000 customer records were ultimately leaked before the bad guy or the attacker broke off demands for a ransom. Optus, the CEO, lost their job over this. The big issue here was that Optus didn't communicate with customers directly. They put a press release out and an ad in the paper to say this has happened. They also used a term, and this is one that I would advise all comms professionals, in fact, almost anyone dealing with an incident, avoid the word sophisticated attack. In this instance, it was very quickly debunked, and it was found to be actually an error or some poorly implemented security that was the problem. The reality is that most cyber attacks occur through some fairly common means. So the idea, they might be executed better and with greater precision now, but they're not really all that sophisticated. Phishing has been around for a very long time. Calling a phishing attack sophisticated, I think it actually talks down to the people who have been attacked. The big lesson here was Optus didn't have actually a plan to communicate with customers, and their government relations were really poorly executed. And this is really interesting because when you think about communicating, do you need to communicate with the government? Depending on what kind of industry you're in, you may actually need to communicate directly with government about what's going on. And that brings us to Medibank. Again, almost 10 million current and former customer records were exfiltrated. And there was a couple of things that caused this to happen. One was a stolen username and password. So that wasn't one stolen from Medibank. That was one that was been stolen previously, and that the bad guys found in a repository of stolen usernames and passwords. And there was a bit of network misconfiguration as well. Ultimately, all the records were released because Medibank refused to pay the ransom. Not paying the ransom is a valid choice, by the way, for organisations. The decision about whether you should pay or not pay ransoms needs to be made in the context of what's going on. The issue here for Medibank was that they weren't going to pay the ransom, but they didn't explain why they weren't paying the ransom. They really failed to communicate that out to their customers or the impacted customers. And because they didn't talk about the why, it meant that they seemed like they really didn't care. It was like, oh, well, 10 million records, we're not paying them, the $2 million or whatever the bad guys were asking for. So we'll let it go. That's kind of how a lot of people perceived it. The lessons are here that different messages are needed for different sorts of people, particularly those that aren't technical. It's one of the challenges of dealing with cybersecurity incidents that often we get stuck inside the technical explanations for why things happen. We need to actually find ways to communicate them in more human terms. So we need to that might be different sorts of messaging for different people. If you're in the health industry, you will have a vast, group of different people, vast groups of different people. You may have older people who are less tech savvy, younger ones who are more tech savvy, and everything else in between. So you need to make sure that your messaging hits everybody in the ways that they will understand. Let's talk about the ugliest one of the lot. So if you remember back around the time of Optus and Medibank, there was a third big breach, and that was Latitude Financial. Millions of, and no one really knows how many records were stolen in this, because of some interesting ways that data was managed in this organization. The bad guys got in using credentials they'd stolen from a third party. So there's your third party coming in, you're somewhere else in their supply chain. And then the attackers were able to move across different systems. So once they got into one, they used that one system to jump into another one, and from that one they went to another, and so forth. The problem here was that Latitude had gone through a whole bunch of acquisitions and divestments and partnerships. So they had so many records in their systems, some of which they should have probably gotten rid of because they no longer had those customers because they'd sold the businesses those customers belonged to. They had other customers that they'd acquired. They had stuff everywhere. It looked like a pretty messy bunch of data from the outside. But the blast radius, or the number of people impacted, looked like it was about 10 million people. So in context, if you only count the adults in Australia, it's probably almost every second person. The issue was that the early communications downplayed everything, and the call centers that they had set up weren't ready for the call volumes. Also, when this happened, their CEO was out of the country, which meant that they didn't actually have a spokesperson who was prepared to speak about this. So there was a lot of responses where people said no comment. The lessons here, don't be caught without a spokesperson. And again, the sophisticated attack narrative was used again in this one, and that's one you need to avoid because this wasn't sophisticated. It was stolen credentials and lateral movement across organizations. This is a very common attack method used by bad guys. The last one on the ugly side, and this is not a cyber incident, but there's some really good illustrations in this about things you should and shouldn't say. This was an oil rig explosion in 2010. 11 people died and a whole bunch of crude oil leaked over about 2 weeks. The environmental impact of this actually still continues. So even though it's 15 years later, this oil rig explosion continues to have impact on the environment. 11 people died. There were all sorts of really, there's been case studies written about this particular incident. BP tried to say it wasn't our fault because it's not our oil platform, we only lease it. It wasn't our people, they were just contractors. There was all sorts of really yucky commentary that came out around this. But the CEO of the company, and if you look back, remember back on that previous slide, 780 million gallons of oil. So that's around about 3 billion litres of oil, to give you some context. He said that was not much, given the ocean's really, really big. And when he was asked about he'd been under the pump for about 24 hours at this point through the media because of this incident. And he said, I'd like my life back, which was a pretty heartless thing to say after 11 people had died on his oil platform, or on their oil platform, sorry. So some of the lessons to learn from the bad and the ugly. You need to show empathy with the people who are impacted. You actually need to practice being calm. During an incident, it is really hard to be calm because there's a lot of stuff going on. So whoever your spokesperson is probably needs a couple of minutes to be able to gather themselves, breathe deeply, and calm themselves down. And they need to be trained. They need to practice crisis scenarios. I would imagine that every organisation that's on this call today and listening in afterwards would have teams of people who regularly play out different crisis scenarios from a technical point of view. You would probably have practiced out disaster recovery plans or business continuity plans regularly. Organisations I've worked at the past did this at least every 6 months. I see now that there's a new trend now around continuous red teaming, where the red team of ethical hackers are always employed to try to break into systems to look for vulnerabilities. You need to start thinking about how your spokespeople are going to be trained if a real bad guy finds something. So what are the things that matter? Ultimately, when some sort of incident takes place, there are 5 things you want to know. You want to know what happened and what you're doing about it. People want to know when it started, where it happened, why it happened, and who it impacts. And you'll notice that one question I haven't put in there is who did it. Your main task during a crisis is not going to be attribution or figuring out who the bad people are or who did the incident. That's a question that may end up being something that only law enforcement can actually answer for you. but you do want to think about who's being impacted so that you can work out who you're going to communicate with. You need to know the when, why, and the when and where and what, so that you can be factual about your answers. When you've got this information assembled, during the first part of your incident response, it gives you the opportunity to own the agenda. The last thing you want is people speculating about what's going on. You don't want the media reading social media accounts or of staff members. You know, it's a really easy thing for them to do. Company X has been breached. Let's look up Company X on LinkedIn. Let's look at the people that work there. Let's see what they're posting. You don't want speculation to get out there. So you want to make sure that you know the facts so that you can own that agenda. Do not speculate. If it was a ransomware attack, say it's a ransomware attack. If someone says, was it the North Koreans or the Upper Babylonians or whatever, say no, it wasn't any of them. We don't know. We're not going to speculate on who did this. What we do know is, and these are the facts that we have. Avoid emotive responses. It's really easy during the heat of the moment to get a bit emotional about things. And my family background is European, like emotion runs through our veins. It's really easy to become emotive in the situation. But you need to avoid that. You need to just stick to facts. So, that means think about the adjectives you're going to use. Don't say it's a really bad incident. Just say, this is an incident which is obviously quite severe, or this is an incident that has impacted X amount of people. But don't, watch out for the adjectives you use when you're describing the incident, and show empathy. For a lot of organizations, you're probably a customer of the places you work at. How would you feel? How do you feel about it being you? Think about that when you start talking about the ways you communicate about things. So consider everyone. It's not just about the logistics of what's going on. It's about how people feel about what's going on. So show the empathy. We're really sorry. This impacts us. I'm a customer and I feel that. I understand how many people might be feeling. Just make sure you don't project too far into that, though. As far as owning the agenda goes, if the media is onto this, they're gonna want briefings about things. So set the times for briefings. Otherwise, you're going to be answering the phone every 5 minutes, particularly during a major incident. So just say, look, we're going to update the media at 2 p.m. today. And that might be your answer. And then if there's something else happens, say, otherwise, we will update the website when we have new information. So put the onus on them to go and get it, not for you to answer the phone every 5 minutes. Decide what's going to be said ahead of time. So have some speaking notes for you so that you do have the facts in front of you. If you don't know an answer, say, look, at this time, we don't have an answer to that question, but as soon as we do, we will report back to you. Don't feed rumors. If someone says, we heard that blah, blah, blah might have happened, say, look, at the moment, the facts as we know them are. It's going to sound boring because often a lot of your response is going to be, the facts as we know them are. And that's how it's going to be. During an emergency, you're not going to know everything. So be prepared to say, look, we don't know, at the moment we are investigating. As we know more, we will let you know, either through the scheduled briefing or by updates to our website, or however else you're going to have as a whatever other regular update medium you're going to use. So let's talk a bit about preparation. How are you actually going to go ahead and start preparing this red team plan for your comms? Start by anticipating all the scenarios that you're thinking about. So I gave you that list of 9 at the very earlier on in the presentation, and plan how you're going to respond to each one of them. So if you had a ransomware attack that impacted 50% of the computers in your organization, how are you going to respond? Prepare documents and processes. The last thing you want to do is be drafting media releases and customer communications, supplier communications, and so forth. The last thing you want to be doing is drafting those for the first time in anger during an incident. Remember, most of the time, it's not just the person who drafts it that's got to write it, but it's probably going to have to go through at least 1 or 2 approval processes internally. It'll probably need to go past some legal people as well to make sure that you're not doing anything you're saying anything that potentially puts you in legal hot water. So you want to make sure you've got as much drafted ahead of time as possible. So that might mean you have boilerplates for different sorts of scenarios prepared with a bit of a fill in the blanks. Know who you're going to communicate with. So for each different type of each scenario, work out who's going to have to be told. Educate all staff about the plan. So let everyone know that in the event of a major incident, you know, Miss Joanna Bloggs is going to be the incident manager, and she will have a team of the following people, or people from the following departments in the organisation. Anything to do with the incident has to be referred to them. So you have that plan and let everyone know what that is. Train your spokespeople and practice regularly. It's great to do training once. It works better if you do it every 6 months or so. If you're going to do an incident enactment or some sort of exercise every 6 months, include the comms in it. What are you going to do for that particular incident scenario that you're testing out each 6 months? And have that single point of contact. The last thing you want is people calling 28 different sources inside your organization. Set that during an incident, all communications must go through the incident communications manager or the incident communications coordinator. So on preparation and anticipating the risks that you might have, there are all sorts of different things that you can have. Don't start thinking how to handle things when the crisis is happening. Think about it beforehand. Having your technical response is not going to help with brand and reputation management. It's great to fix the problem, but how you communicate about what you're doing is just as important. In fact, it may even be more important, because you might fix the whole thing technically, but you may never regain the trust of your customers and suppliers. So you want to make sure that you do fix things. If we go back to that Red Cross incident, the Red Cross came out of that, I think, really, really well because of the way they communicated. The company that was involved in accidentally leaking that data folded within 12 months. And be prepared to communicate with media, government staff, customers, suppliers, and everyone else. Have the communications ready to go so that all you've got to do is fill in some blanks, make sure everyone's happy that the facts are right, and have them ready to go. Let's talk about the response team. Know who it is before you start. Don't wait until the incident, you're in the middle of an incident to go, right, who do we have to get together to fix this problem? Think about your scenarios and think about who the best people to bring into the room are. It's likely that you're going to involve legal. You're probably going to involve HR, most likely. I would always suggest involve your marketing team, because they're the ones that have probably got the expertise in how to communicate. Talk to your PR team. It might be separate to your marketers. It may be an external party, but make sure that everyone knows who's going to be in that team. Make sure that they get regularly trained. Know who's going to make the decisions and be the coordinator. The last thing you want to do is have a room full of 6 senior managers and they all want to be in charge. Determine the strategy for your crisis and decide what information goes and when it goes. Prepare written notifications to everybody that needs to be prepared ahead of time, and make sure that you document what's happened, because you want to actually look at the incident once the dust settles and learn from it. This is why I always say do the exercises, a couple of times a year, because you can learn from those as well. But also, once an incident is over and you're back to business as usual, go back and look at what actually worked and didn't work in your plan and update your plan so you learn from it. So as I said, the sorts of people that you want to have in there, you want to have a senior representative or a board representative. You need, if the incident only impacts a specific business unit, have someone from there involved. Corporate comms, marketing directors, we work with organizations as their corporate comms partner and help them with their crisis communications. You need legal, you may have your insurance team involved. Being a technical issue, you may want to have you probably do want someone technical in the room to explain things, and HR, because obviously there's some people impact. And if you get all of this stuff together and you do it and practice it regularly, when an incident happens, you have the potential to actually come out positively at the end of this. There have been a number of companies that have suffered significant breaches that looked pretty bad at the time, but because they handled them well, they didn't just recover well, but they actually increased their customer retention, increased their sales, because they showed that they actually had a plan and were prepared. It's the companies and organizations that aren't prepared that suffer the most. The preparation is worth so much value to you. So with that, let's have a look if we've got some questions, because that's the end of our formal presentation. Oops, stop share. And I'm back. Let's have a look. There's some stuff in the Q&A. So Kathryn, do you want to come back on camera and maybe let's see if we've got some questions?
Yeah, there is a question from Eldar about Oracle's communication around the recent legacy cloud breach responses and announcements. Anthony.
I'm going to have a very, very quick look at this because I don't know enough about it.
Yeah, and I am the same because our remit's very much Australia. So I don't feel.
So let me just have a look. I mean, this is my very cursory look at this. Okay. They talked about it being an attack. They talked about how the compromise happened. They talk about their timeline. They talk about what happened and how it happened. And they've just got a very high level of what their response is.
That's what's available on their website at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is, So they talk about going to all the affected customers directly, but not through public disclosure initially. And that they're continuing. Basically, they're saying, look, this thing happened. We've told all the people what's happened and it's under investigation. Now, that may seem like a very high level kind of response to give, but it's actually realistic because a lot of the time when an incident happens, you may not know everything about it. But what you do want to know is communicate what you know to the right people in a timely way. Avoiding public disclosure, which I think is their way of saying we didn't send a media release or go directly to the media first. That's a good policy in general because you may not have enough to give them, but you can go to customers and say, look, the following records, I'll give you a good example. I was, a whole bunch of my data was stolen in a breach in Victoria I'm going to go about 6 or 7 years ago. And I received an email from that organisation saying, we were the victims of a breach. The breach happened like this. These are the customer records this is the customer data relating to you that we believe was impacted. And they gave me a list. And then they said, we are following up through law enforcement and we'll be working with experts to update our systems and ensure that this doesn't happen again. A lot of the time, there's not a lot more you can tell a customer than that. And when I look at that Oracle response, that seems like what they've gone down.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I would add is that you can't just rely on the media to inform your customers. You need to directly communicate with them. If you have questions from journalists, then you should respond, not say no comment, even if effectively you haven't got anything that you can actually say. You just need to explain where it's at, what the facts are, and that as you've got information, you will provide it, rather than just seeming defensive and saying no comment. Just give them the why. Yeah. It's always going to be better than seeming like you're trying to hide or, yeah.
Yeah. I love this. We've got a question from someone in Switzerland. Is there a real world example of good crisis management? Look, I got the incident that I mentioned earlier at the Red Cross Blood Service is an example of how it was done really well. The thing is, my gut feeling is that the incidents that are handled really, really well, you don't hear about.
Yeah, you don't hear about it.
Because they're handled well.
They've neutralised it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting when you look at that Red Cross Blood Service, the data was only exposed for about 24 hours, and it only really became public because one of the people it was ethically disclosed to was another cybersecurity researcher, Troy Hunt, who runs Have I Been Pwned? And because when it hit Troy, it becomes newsworthy because stuff that Troy does is newsworthy a lot of the time. That's why that one became super public, and also because it was obviously a reasonably large amount of information, and it was the Red Cross Blood Service, so it was a health-related one. So that one, I think that's probably the best example, George, from Switzerland that we've got there. But there are many case studies that you can go and look at. I mean, I only picked out 5, I think, off the top for today. But I go back to the basics. It's only report the facts. Think about the impact on people when you talk about those facts and temper your language so that it considers them and is empathetic to the people that have been impacted. And don't speculate and make stuff up. where there is people will try to fill in the blanks when you don't provide information when something goes public. So be really clear that the facts are 1, 2, 3, and as we know more, we will report it. But at the moment, that is all that is known, and be really clear about that in making sure that your language is suitable for the audience you're speaking to. A lot of this really comes down to not just what you say, but how you say it.
And media training is quite key for that. Actually practicing, the types of media interviews you could be faced with based on the scenarios you've identified are a key risk. That way, if it happens, your spokesperson has already role played and had a chance to go through what the questions might be and how they're going to deliver the message. Rather than the first time it's happening is when you're actually in an incident. Practice and prepare as much as possible beforehand. There's another question, Anthony, I think.
Yeah. How do you manage who takes point on public comms when multiple parties are involved? This is a great question. It requires your senior management or board or whoever it is that's your primary, your top of the line decision maker in the organisation to call it and say, this is the spokesperson. It's really interesting. When we talk about who the spokesperson can be, I always recommend have 2, because sometimes people are away, so at least have 1 backup. But also think about the nature of the incident. Is this an incident that you're going to be asked about over and over and over again? Or is it an incident which is just going to happen once and kind of disappear from memory? Because that may influence who you call as your spokesperson.
The severity when you're analysing what risks and how you rank them based on how likely and how severe they would be for the organisation. If something is ranked incredibly high and severe in your plans, then that probably has to be the CEO, because for an incident of that type, if the CEO doesn't come out and speak, the media aren't going to accept that. They want to hear from the key decision maker and who's at the helm of the business, and there's no way around that. But if it's of a lesser risk or a lesser, impact, then maybe it can be someone from the technical team. It doesn't have to be the CEO in that case that can handle it. You just have to weigh it up. But there are some issues that, if you imagine Optus, if the CEO didn't comment, there would have been media stories written about the lack of comment. It had to be the CEO in that case.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It really depends on the nature of the incident will determine it, but you need to know who those people are going to be, and they need to be trained and prepared. When we do media training around crisis comms, it's not the sort of thing where you can just do it once and you're done. You need to repeat it. Our model is to start it off fairly gently, and then over subsequent sessions make it harder and harder. And certainly when I ask the questions, I get nastier and nastier. It's hard to imagine I'm going to be nasty, but it's what I do in those sessions, because sometimes those interviews can become really, really tense. So you've got to try to make sure that you're prepared for that tension.
Anthony, there's another question.
What's that? Got George, Angela McCann's this last question. When there's a third party who wants to speak and your CEO also wants to speak and messaging isn't aligned. So just to be clear, Angela, is this where you're talking about it's not just you that's impacted with an incident, there's a third party and each wants to address the media, but you haven't got your stories straight between the 2 different organisations? I think that's the scenario we're talking about there. Yeah, did you want to comment on that, Kathryn?
Yeah, I would stick to the facts as you see it from your organisation. Ideally, if you have trusted third parties that you work closely with, you would discuss some of these things and develop plans together, and that you would have some agreement on your media protocols and the messaging that would be used. So again, rather than trying to solve it in the moment, you have those conversations and call those roundtables together with key partners and consider what your risks are as a group and how you would all respond, and what can you agree as a consensus are the messages that you would both put out consistently. But at the end of the day, you're speaking on behalf of your organisation. and then you need to present your organisation in the best light. So if a third party is saying something, as long as it's not different. I mean, if the facts are the facts and they can't be disputed and it's been confirmed and you're not speculating, the facts are the same. So that should be able to have agreement on.
Yeah, a good example of this might be your business has a major SaaS software provider that provides you services, as for software. And I would recommend that if they're a major supplier of yours, then they're probably a risk that you need to look at in your risk register. And then you need to determine, well, if that major supplier is breached in some way, what's the impact on our business? And then treat it that way. And then once you identify and work out what your response would be, it may well be that you need to go to that provider and say, look, we hope this never happens, but if you're breached and it causes impact to our customers, here's our plan. And then for them to come back and say, they'll tell you what their plan is. It may be aligned, it may not be aligned. But ultimately, you're responsible for your own business, not their business, even though they might be a significant partner. So I always think most of these things get resolved if people communicate beforehand and figure it out before. If you're trying to work out the who's who in the middle of an incident, you're probably going to be in trouble because you just won't have the bandwidth to manage that and everything else that's happening in your business.
And I would also try to avoid apportioning blame. At the end of the day, if you think of it from a customer lens, they want to have security that you can solve this problem, that you're remediating it fast enough, and you want to win their trust and hold on to their trust throughout the process. So a bit like the Red Cross example Anthony went through, sometimes you just own it so that you can control the message and the agenda. It's happened. This is what we're doing about it now. These are the steps we are taking. Rather than kind of, trying to shirk it back and forth over who's actually ultimately responsible, deal with the fallout, minimize the risk.
Yeah. When I went in that slide where I said the who, what, why, when, where, and I said in the who, you're not really thinking about attribution as the who. You're thinking about the impact of the who. It's the same thing. If it's a third-party supplier that's the issue, don't start pointing fingers. It's not going to help. Because the other thing is you may end up in combat. If you say they did it, and I'll go, no, but it was our system, but it was you had the weak login that let people in, you'll end up in a finger pointing game, and that's completely unhelpful.
And from a customer point of view, they don't care how it all works in your back end. They believe that, they're trusting in your brand, and so therefore you're accountable to them. So you have to communicate from that point of view. Not just, try and say, oh, it's not our fault. It's all because of this, third party.
I really love the comment that George has just put into the chat. And because I don't mind a bit of etymology and understanding where words come from, I love this, that the word crisis actually comes from the Greek word that means to choose or decide. Crisis management is decision-making. I would add to that decision-making in anger often or under stress. Yep. And the more decisions you make before the thing happens that you can just automatically flow to, the better you're going to be at managing the incident. So if we take that word and talk about this being a decision-making exercise, think about all your scenarios and think about all the decisions you could possibly have to make, as many as you can anyway, before you have to go and actually make them. So think about what the questions you're going to be asked are and prepare for them. If you're in a breach, customer's going to say, was it my data? What of my data? What does this mean? Do I have to get a new driver's license? Do I have to go and buy, get a new passport? All, they're the questions your customers are going to ask. So have them ready. Sorry, Kat.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think if you can't reach consensus with your trusted partners that you're working with, then at least you've drawn a line in the sand and said, well, this is what we're going to be doing. You'll have visibility of what they might do. And so you communicate from that point of view that we are doing these actions. This is what we have done to remediate the problem, and this is what we're doing. And so you're very much on the front foot, and you're always, remember when you were talking to the media, you're actually talking to your customers. It's all about your business, your brand, your reputation, and protecting that. So it's not really about talking to the journalist. It's what message do you want your customers to hear and potential customers, which is why some organizations can emerge stronger because they actually, win more trust through the process, not what happened, how they handled it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? It's a really old breach, but when eBay got pinged years and years ago, they increased the number of people buying and selling through eBay after a breach. And people go, well, hang on a sec. How can that happen? And they go, well, because they responded in a way that supported their customers. They fixed the problem. They also were very public about what they fixed, what the problem was, and what they did to alleviate it. And they came out looking better than what they did beforehand, because people are all of a sudden, well, hang on a minute, if we live in a world where things can happen, I want to be living in a world where if something happens, the people I deal with are prepared for it and can manage it. I know a number of the people on this call today work in organisations that hold some highly sensitive information. Your customers want to know that if something happens, you're doing the very, very best to protect them and to minimise the impact on them. And you can do that by being prepared.
Yeah.
If there are any other further questions? Okay. Well, thank all the people who have joined us in directly today. Thank you for your questions. They've been really, really interesting and made me think a bit more about what we do. If you need to contact either Kathryn or I, our email address, you can get us at info@mediawize.com. You'll find us you'll find that on the website as well. There's a contact form there. Or you can email us directly, either Anthony@mediawize.com or Kathryn@mediawize.com. But with that, we're going to finish a little bit early, which is very unusual in webinar land for a webinar to actually finish a couple of minutes early. But if you do have any other questions for us afterwards, please feel free to send them through, and everyone will get a copy of the video from today, so you can refer back to it if you need to. But thanks everyone for your time. Thanks for your questions, and we look forward to hearing back from you one day soon. Bye-bye.